This video was sponsored by Soil and Health, Organic New Zealand. We support a GE-free New Zealand. If you support us, please become a member and help stop the degradation of our natural food and environment. Visit our website by clicking on the link, and for just $45 a year, you will help make this dream a reality for every New Zealander. Consumer choice and our environment should not be compromised by genetic engineering. Thank you.
I started looking at this debate intently around 15 years ago and have studied it thoroughly since. And before I started, I was pro-GM. And now I genuinely see it as the biggest threat to food and agriculture we've ever faced. And I don't take that lightly. The reason I was pro-GM was because I was relying on our Grains Council to provide us with information, because it wasn't an area I knew much about. So everyone in Grains Council sort of had specific areas. But no one really knew much about it. We were actually given information from a policy advisor. We'd never had a policy advisor on a specific issue before. But in this case, I eventually found out our policy advisor was actually a representative from the GM industry. So it was Paula Fitzgerald from Agri-Food Awareness, and she was paid $100,000 a year by the research sector, our GRDC, which is farmer levies and government funding as well, to be the key policy advisor in all the farm lobby groups to push a pro-GM policy. And we only heard one side of the story, and it was extraordinarily over-exaggerated on any possible benefits and totally ignored the risks and risk management. So the more I looked into this, it's one of those issues, the more you know you don't know. And it was very disturbing of the misleading deception that was promoted through farm lobby groups. But since then, and I was given a real hard time, because it was like the public relations campaign was like a football team just prior to the start of the first match. And those that were supporting GM were boosted up to be real heroes and you know, progressive and often young, influential farmers. And you know, we've all excited and a religious fervour about this. They're really amped up. And those that were against it, the attacks and trying to discredit any information was ridiculous. The vehement attacks on people. And then it was introduced, and it was like the very first, you know, all this hype and fluff about GM, and it failed dismally, just like the first football match when you've got kindy kids playing against the VFL. You know, it did not perform anywhere near. And you know, some of those supporting it slinked off into the distance. Many rang me up and apologised profusely for the very hard time that they gave me in Grains Council and through the agri-political sector. And some are still waving the flag and trying to give their stance credibility. But let's look at what actually happened. So we in Australia, we can summarise saying there was no benefit, the risks are real, and there's no risk management. So before GM release, we were promised everything about what GM canola would do. I mean, sometimes it was meant to yield twice as much, which gradually the yield potential went down as we proved there was no reason for it. And it was definitely going to give you better economic returns. Well, after release, there's very little agronomic benefits. It's only resistant to a different chemical than our existing varieties. And that chemical, Roundup, can only be sprayed between the 2 or 6 leaf stage, or it gives you a yield penalty. So now we're talking about yield penalties, not a yield advantage. And it doesn't, and because it's such a narrow window, you've got our worst weed is radish, and it kept popping up all through the crop, and there's no post-emergent control, and there's no tolerance at the end use because it's a very bitter weed that's similar to canola. So there were much better non-GM alternatives, and the research sector have not been very happy with sort of the way things have gone. They didn't expect it to go quite how they planned either. But the risks are very real. Now, we were told we were scaremongering when we mentioned risks, but contamination is inevitable. Well, everyone admits that now. We were told, no, contamination won't happen. And market rejection and penalties are associated with GM and GM contaminated produce. Now, we were told, no, that's wrong. Well, it is. There's $50 a tonne price penalty associated with GM, and they still can't sell it at that price, and there's not much grown. So they're having a lot of trouble selling it at $50 a tonne less than the non-GM. And we have an organic farmer, Steve Marsh, who was very concerned because his neighbour wanted to grow GM. So he sent him a legal letter saying, please don't plant GM where it will drift onto my property, because I will not accept any economic loss if your GM contaminates my organic farm. And you have to keep it contained on your property. It should not be up to me to try and keep it out. So he pre-warned him this, but the GM farmer planted it right next to his property, on the paddock closest to his property, and then he swathed it. So that means he cut it down so that it dries evenly. And then it sits like a paddock full of newspapers. The first puff of wind, it blew across the fence, of course, into his organic farm, and Steve lost his organic status. So Steve said, well, why should I accept that economic loss? So he did what our government recommended, which disgusts me still to this day. The common law will work. Common law means that the non-GM farmer must sue the GM farmer. Well, why should it be the non-GM farmer or the GM farmer that's liable? Really, what we were pushing for, I spent well over a decade lobbying for, was the strict liability legislation. The GM industry was the one that was going to get the benefit. The GM industry was the one that was saying, she'll be right, mate, and expecting farmers to carry the loss. It should have been them putting their money where their mouth is and accepting liability for any economic loss that their product causes. Now, that's not unreasonable, but it was denied. So that's why we've got farmer versus farmer, and Steve Marsh's case sets a legal precedent for the world, because it's the first time a non-GM farmer has said, no, I won't accept it, and that's coming up next month. So there was no risk management. They denied strict liability legislation, and the non-GM farmer is liable for proving their non-GM status. So we were told coexistence was possible, and that that 0.9% was accepted in contamination. But that is not true. And we told the Minister for Agriculture prior to the decision being made was that that no GM is accepted in any market. But another problem is that this causes neighbourhood disputes, so much so that kids are fighting at school. It's causing such a huge rift among the community. And the shires or the councils, they are also liable for controlling the GM that's in their boundaries to stop that causing economic loss. I was part of the Minister's Advisory Committee, and these are extracts out of the report that we prepared for him. And he knew full well, and yet he's still promising that 0.9% was okay. He knew full well that non-GM or GM-free legally means no GM. Now, New Zealand was part of the first test case on this where Food Standards Australia New Zealand plus 2 New Zealand regulatory bodies successfully prosecuted a New Zealand company for misleading labelling. The Auckland company, Bean Supreme, was fined when only 0.0088% of GM soy content was found in vegetarian sausages labelled as either GM-free or non-GM. Now, we were told that 0.9 was okay, so why did they tell us and continue to tell us 0.9 was okay? But why the 0.9% threshold? The rationale for establishing thresholds is because inadvertent presence, which is a fancy name for contamination, is considered unavoidable. So yeah, they said, oh yeah, we know contamination is going to happen, but we've got to promise coexistence so we can give the non-GM farmer a choice. So let's lie and tell everyone 0.9 is okay. The 0.9 is based on what triggers a GM label if any contamination is found along the supply chain. But the 0.9, if you get it to the end product and all of your tests have proved negative, it triggers a GM label. It doesn't need a GM label because you can say it's accidental. But if anywhere along that supply chain any contamination is found, it has to be sold as GM. So the 0.9 is not what is accepted in a non-GM label. It is 0. And coexistence is therefore not possible. So don't let them promise that. To give the choice for a GM grower to grow it means that the non-GM grower loses their choice to market non-GM. So farmers, when they deliver to our storage and handler cooperative bulk handling, we agree under the terms in a book that is given to us all, and the declaration is that we guarantee that there is no GM in any of the grain we deliver. That means wheat as well. If it's got a little bit of GM canola, we are breaching our contract. But more importantly, we also accept the liability, so we indemnify the storage and handler if they cause any contamination. So anywhere along the supply chain, the non-GM farmer who didn't want or need this product and trying to avoid it is liable for any contamination, any recall of the product. So if a ship gets stuck off Japan or off port somewhere and the markets say, no, we've just done a test and it's got contamination, we're not going to accept it, the demurrage, the cost of having the ship stuck off port, and the recall of the product, the contamination cleanup, the millions of dollars to do that comes back to the non-GM farmer that didn't want anything to do with this and couldn't prevent it. Worse still, the GM company is actually rewarded for contamination. So I was on the Minister's Advisory Committee, as I mentioned, and we were given access to the contract between Monsanto and the storage and handler. Now, that contract not only told the storage and handler how to charge and deal with the GM canola, in that agreement, the quotes are that CBH, or the storage and handler, is to retain positive test strips. So they must test everybody's seed. So if you're all non-GM growers and say, I'm a GM grower and I'm in your district, and you'll know you'll probably get contamination. If an eagle lands in my plot even, the pollen can stay alive for 5 to 7 days, so it can land in any of your crops, and it's a dominant gene, so you know, wherever it lands, the GM will be the result. And you won't know. You won't know if I'm next door to you. I don't have to tell you. And so they test your grain, and if it tests positive, which is only a 0.5% amount, well then the test strips are kept, and Monsanto has those. Also, the storage and handler must fine you because you said it was non-GM and it's GM. So so far you've got $50 a tonne less because you have to sell as GM, and you've got a significant fine from the storage and handler, and Monsanto's holding your test strip. Because Australia and New Zealand signed the UPOV 91 International Treaty, the same as Brazil, the right to deduct an endpoint royalty to back for research. Now, that works with our plant breeder rights because we say we're growing a particular variety. But Monsanto has proof you're growing their GM. So what happens, so they have the legal right to deduct 100% of their user fee for you using something you didn't want, or not using the trait, out of our grain payment. So we just get a sheet saying that so if half of you tested positive, you all get, when you get your grain payments, you've had that amount deducted out of you have the, they have the right to do that, to deduct that out of your grain payment.
100% of your
100% of everything that you've delivered out of that contaminated load is charged, you have to pay Monsanto. Now in Brazil, you say that couldn't possibly happen, but Brazil adopted the same treaty. And yes, that does happen, just like that, when they deliver to Cargill. But they got sick of doing the testing, so they brought in a blanket thing where everybody pays Monsanto unless you prove that there is no GM in your produce, which will be a bit hard when you're living in such a GM area, and which will account for why there was a rapid increase in GM growers in Brazil that year. It was because, they said, well, there's lots growing it now. Everyone's paying the user fee. So this is extraordinary, allowing Monsanto to write their own coexistence protocols. The government supporting the GM industry to hold growers to ransom like this. But before GM, it's supposed to be up to the research sector to keep their trials in. Now, they do the trials where the seed bulk up occurs. So where our non-GM seed, our existing seed banks, are all doing the trials, where we all grow our non-GM seed. And plunk right in the middle would be your trials. Well, it's happening in New Zealand here. I've noticed the same thing happening. And then in no time at all, one of our Network of Concerned Farmers members, Geoffrey Carraher, he tested his seed and sure enough came up positive, 0.5% contamination in his non-GM seed before it was even commercially released. So he put in a nice sign saying, Bayer, come on, remove your genes, because he thought that it was their responsibility to remove it. But no, under the legislation, when they do a trial, they don't have to prevent contamination, they only have to minimise contamination. So, the farmers have to wear the cost, the industry has to wear the costs. And then after GM, it's supposed to be the non-GM growers meant to keep it out. Well, why should it? The GM grower should be keeping it in. It shouldn't be up to the non-GM grower to try and keep it out. So what is GM? There's a big confusion there. The science sector will be ramming this down our throat. So, well, they did with us and they will with you. Particularly, you've got a science, a biotech conference coming up on September the 2nd, and they will start their push with absolute vigour after that. So, genetically modified is the wording in the legislation, but we've been modifying genes conventionally. It's not modified, that's a very misleading term. Genetic engineering is a more appropriate term, or recombinant DNA is the technical term, or transgenics. You're taking one gene out of any organism and all you're doing is putting it into the big stack. So it's one gene, adding it to the 30,000 genes in a non-GM variety. So you have your non-GM variety. The most common variety grown is the resistance to glyphosate, the Roundup Ready. What they've done is taken the gene out of soil bacteria found in the factory sludge ponds of Monsanto's chemical factories where they make Roundup, because the bacteria has become resistant to the chemical in the factory. Taken the gene out, rammed it into the DNA, the plant becomes resistant to that chemical made in the factory. But it's covered by a patent. Because it's so different, it's covered by a patent rather than plant breeder right. So you can easily do it by non-GM means. Our weeds are developing resistance just like the soil bacteria did. But you can't get a patent over that. And there's major GM restrictions for the scientists. It takes a long time, it's very expensive, there's market rejection, there's all this protesting, which of course they supposedly can't understand. It's definitely not precise. They take the gene, they add the viral promoter, it's optional whether they add the antibiotic resistant marker gene. They coat gold or tungsten bullets and they fire it into the DNA, or they invade it in with a bacteria like E. coli, invade it in. They hope that these genes might stick. They can be upside down, they can be bent, they can be broken bits, there can be many of them, they can insert anywhere along the DNA. They can damage what's already there. Remember that one bent gene in a human causes Down syndrome, so you know it's going to cause a bit of problem. And then they hope that some stick. Only 1 in a million work, and the mutations are weeded out. So you've got a lot of mutations. They just weed out everything except what looks roughly like a plant. And then they call it substantially equivalent, meaning it's meant to look the same, be the same as a non-GM, conventional breeding. There's nothing like conventional breeding. But we've been promised the world. Here we are 16 years later. You've got two sorts. The herbicide tolerant, where the crop absorbs herbicide. It doesn't repel it like the non-GM ability to do that. Or BT, where the crop produces its own insecticide. So that's why you get told it lowers the insecticide use, is because the plant produces itself. It's not less into the environment. And you can't wash it out of your corn when you eat it. And the herbicide tolerant, they increase the tolerance level of glyphosate by 200 times because it absorbs the herbicide. So they said, oh, well, we just have to up the rate that you're allowed to eat.
That's the maximum residue.
Maximum residue limit, thank you. So the most popular is the resistance to Roundup. And it only took 1 year for enterprising drug barons to do that by non-GM means when they started the aerial spraying of the coca plantations. So you don't need it by GM means, but it's all about the patent. And the non-GM biotechnology, all those other techniques, produces everything that we've been promised. But the difference with this, and why biotechnology is a problem, is because Monsanto owns a lot of the patents of biotechnology and the intellectual property, and the US government does, and there's a race to own more and more by the research sector. And they're holding the public plant breeders to ransom. They say, we've got these patents, you either have to pay us a fortune, which governments don't want to support because it's public plant breeding, or you cut these alliances deal, where you bring us in and we get to add one gene onto all your lovely varieties that you've bred using these technologies, and then we own a patent over your crops. So let's get in business together and skip down the aisle and make a lot of money out of farmers doing this together. So farmers will not be left behind. The race is for investors and scientists. So the public plant breeders' aim is to profit from intellectual property by forming alliances with corporate companies. GM makes more profit for plant breeders and corporate companies, profits from farmers. That's why the mentality with the science and the government institutes is GM is the answer. Now, what was the question? But why GM? Is it to feed the world, or is it to feed the hungry corporates? Well, it's certainly not to do with feeding the world. We waste 1/3 of our food, we throw it out as it is. So the world's not going to go hungry. And the GM industry even came to the conclusion that that was an inappropriate strategy, but it got the international push to push that through the Bretton Woods groups, the World Trade Organisation, etc. So after $12 million, 4-year research, 110 countries and 900 experts, they came up with a summary that, no, the GM performance is very questionable. It's not what it's cracked up to be. The GM introduces additional liabilities for GM and non-GM farmers, but the patents, you know, if you remove the patents, you would remove the drive to force GM on a reluctant population. GM patents concentrate ownership, drive up cost, undermine economic sustainability and food security, inhibit seed saving because you can't replant your own seeds, and restrict access to products needed for independent trials. So even a GM farmer can't match their GM against their non-GM without and tell their neighbour about it without the results being vetted by Monsanto and approved whether you can talk about it or not. And same with health trials. So it's not about feeding the world. So what is it about? Corporate control aim. In 1999 at an industry biotech conference, a representative from Arthur Andersen Consulting Group revealed that their company had helped Monsanto create a strategy to own the patents for 100% of all commercial seeds grown and to ensure natural seeds were virtually extinct. Well, now you see what's sort of happening with these alliances. What you are seeing is not just a consolidation of seed companies, it's really a consolidation of the entire food chain. Well, that sounds a bit much. How would they do that? We're going to have choice, aren't we? So if you look at each of the industries, upstream and downstream on the supply chain, you have got fewer and fewer, thank you, you have got fewer and fewer industries on every level. So, you know, with the supermarkets, you've got, with mergers and alliance, you've got less and less of these individual entities. But farmers, there's lots of us. And because there's lots of us, we can deal with whoever we want, upstream and downstream. And because of that, that keeps competition alive. And because that competition is alive, the consumers, where there's a whole lot of as well, they can buy from whoever they want. So this consumer will be different to this consumer. And you can even buy direct from a farmer through the grower markets. So it's your choice. But with the patent, now remember, the research sector is looking at adding a patented gene to every variety produced. The patent, the crop belongs to Monsanto. And Monsanto's agronomists dictate how the farmer farms Monsanto's crops. And the farmer does the work, pays the bills and takes the risk. Now, Canadian farmers are saying, a great documentary by Gay Marshall, she went over there and farmers, the Canadian farmers lamented saying, I had some pimple-faced agronomist coming onto my property, there was half a dozen insects there and they told me to spray my crop. And I had to do that. We've become the serfs and the patent owners becomes the lords. So the farmer does the work, pays the bill and takes the risk. And somebody else tells you how to farm. And Monsanto dictates who the farmer delivers to and who they sell it to. Now that bit's really important. So you've got the government pushing these alliances where the plant breeders are saying, yeah, it's best to get in bed with these companies and they consider trades. And the government's saying, well, how best can Australia capitalise on its publicly funded biotechnology? So that is why our national biotechnology strategy, the strategy underpinning all our legislation, says the main aim is to attract essential foreign investment and development partners. So there was $125 million that the government allocated to push biotechnology and promote it, and every government policy is pro-GM. And farmers' concerns are being deliberately ignored and a lot of money spent to try and pacify us, and everything's a public relations campaign, not with any guts. And our Federal Minister for Agriculture, Warren Truss, said, how can we attract investment into research if we ban the use of the product? So it's all about the plant breeder. And in West Australia, all of our public plant breeders merged to form Intergrain, of which the Department of Agriculture is the main shareholder in that. And the Minister for Agriculture holds the portfolio for the Department of Agriculture. So when the Minister for Agriculture said yes, Intergrain sold off a 19.9% share of all of the plant breeding of past intellectual property, etc., and all the varieties, to Monsanto for a measly $10.5 million, a 19.9% share, with a promise that 20% each year. And all of Intergrain's seed is sold by New Farm's fully owned subsidiary, New Seed. So suddenly these bottom two blocks are controlled by Monsanto through their alliance partner, and your seed is all locked up with Monsanto's alliance partner, New Farm, who sells all of Monsanto's Roundup. So if that happens, if we don't have a choice, if there's not going to be any non-GM varieties, if they add a gene to every variety produced, we are all going to be Monsanto farmers under their contracts where they tell us how to farm, what products to use and who to sell to. So that has somebody else dictating who we decide to deal with. Now, everyone along that supply chain has Monsanto dictating their contracts with them to be part of that supply chain, and that removes all competition. So that's why Monsanto gets their stated aim to own and control the global food supply, because this isn't just happening in West Australia, this is happening globally. So the stated aim, own the patent for 100% of all commercial seeds grown. Consolidation of the entire food chain starts to make a lot more sense now. And it's a hell of a thing to say that the way we win is don't give the consumer a choice, but that might be it. One company deciding what you eat. It might be just frozen pre-packaged meals with colouring and flavouring. Soy sludge, that may be in the future. You know, you get what they want to sell you. So if they're going to force you to eat it, you want to know if it's safe. There's 60 research papers that say it's not. There's serious concerns. And they want them addressed thoroughly. Roughly a summary would be, in the first generation, damaged immune systems and increased allergies, development of lesions and precancerous growths, unusually enlarged or damaged organs, temporary infertility and unexplained death. Well, that's certainly a lot to worry about. Second generation in developing animals or young kids, smaller brain, liver and testicles, immune system damage and metabolic change, organ damage, abnormal anxiety and aggression, precancerous tumour findings, infertility up to 100% permanent male sterility in offspring, and abnormally high death rates. These are common findings in the testing. This is really serious. But our regulatory process is meant to look at health. We shouldn't worry about it. Remember, they say that's rigorously tested. Okay, let's look at what happens. We have the Office of the Gene Technology Regulator in Australia. They handball the responsibility to Food Standards Australia and New Zealand to do the testing, who, because of substantial equivalence, handballs the responsibility to health testing to Monsanto to prove it is unsafe rather than safe, because it's meant to be the same. Well, why would a company want to prove their product's unsafe? They want to sell as much of it as possible. So if you look at canola is crushed, and half is for oil for human, half is for meal for stock feed. The oil for human consumption was not tested. Monsanto didn't do the tests on that. Instead, they did the meal for stock feed. And they found an increase in liver weight of 17% in only a few weeks' feeding trials. Well, that indicates some sort of a toxic reaction to those rats. But it was totally ignored, not because they found any other reason, but because FSANZ has no authority over stock food. So Monsanto chose to do testing on something that escaped the regulation. So what do they actually think about stock food? Well, it's not in Australia's contract, but in the USA contract, it is recommended that Roundup-ready winter canola not be grazed. At the present time, insufficient information exists to allow safe and proper grazing recommendations. And yes, GM companies have paid compensation for stock losses. So where to next? We'll ask a few questions. The pricing structure. With GM grasses getting pushed, and you don't have to plant GM grass each year. So once it's in and it spreads to your neighbours as well. So what are they going to charge? Are they going to charge a percentage, an annual fee or a percentage of your milk production? Are they going to tell you how to farm? And how do farmers opt out if their conditions become unmanageable, unprofitable? And are you going to take out the Monsanto loans where because you can't pay their bills because you're not making enough profit, you use your land as security, which the broker you get, the richer they get and the more chance they have of getting your farms? Monsanto's pricing structure. It's bizarre. Now, it's interesting to know that 80% of most GM crops are grown in USA, and 80% of the commodity-based subsidies are allocated to their GM crops, soy, cotton and corn. But Monsanto's shareholder, the addendum to their annual report on the GM BT cotton, looked at its pricing structure. Now, Monsanto does trials, and every trial I've seen has definitely favoured their variety because for some reason they cannot grow a non-GM crop anywhere like even the poorest farmer I know grows a non-GM crop. But so they do their trials and they come up with their benefit. They value their benefit and then they charge the farmer a 100% of that benefit. Plus, no doubt, I mean, you can just see this happening. You've got all the eager farmers doing their little trials on their property and they tick the boxes. Did you get ease of use, peace of mind, more time with the family as they're having a beer and getting wined and dined? Yeah, I had all of those. Monsanto values that and then charges them 20 to 30% of what Monsanto values things like more time with the family. So there is no way that a farmer will benefit financially from GM crops. GM wheat, intergrain breeds wheats, and we are having a major push for GM wheat, which is extraordinary because no market in the world will accept GM wheat. The reason no GM wheat is grown commercially anywhere in the world is because you have to label GM wheat. The GM crops, soy, cotton, corn and canola, escape labelling because they're oil or stock feed. But wheat doesn't. So there's major market resistance. Now the Canadian Wheat Board lamented the reason it wasn't grown in Canada is because the Canadian Wheat Board said, well, our markets have said that if anyone grows commercial GM wheat in Canada, we'll stop buying wheat from Canada. And here's West Australia wanting to buy it in. It's too difficult and too expensive to segregate. No market wants it. And they're ramming it down farmers' throats. So it's nothing short of industry sabotage because all our wheat becomes unsaleable. So the government puts their vested interest, wanting to make money out of farmers, ahead of our agricultural industry. Now the next wave is GM pharmaceutical and industrial crops where they produce the plant to produce drugs such as blood pressure drugs or Viagra or abortion drugs for pigs, etc. And industrial crops that make plastic ingredients, etc. And we're meant to plant that in paddocks with food. Now you're going to get contamination. We cannot accept the liabilities, say we've got no GM, so it's intended that we lose our ability to grow GM-free food. But what consumer do you know would accept an unknown quantity of pharmaceutical industrial products in their food? None, but they expect the farmers to guarantee there's none in it and you won't be able to do it. So farmers could actually lose the ability to grow food. And you can't have one drug contaminating another. So here we have the vested interest of the scientists totally destroying the food supply, and yet they're trying to claim it's to grow food for the future. The food's going to be short. Well, you can see why it's going to be short. So you've got this major battlefield going on in Australia. Don't let this happen where you've got this side getting bigger and bigger on false promises of GM. Start taking it seriously and make your voice heard because you will be punished for your complacencies. Risks cannot be managed, and because of that, I genuinely see it as the biggest threat to food and agriculture we've ever faced. So thank you very much.
I've been farming in Victoria now since I returned to the farm in the late 80s. I spent about 10 years in marketing. Prior to that, working in the electronic media field. In fact, one thing I haven't claimed yet in New Zealand, which is true, I actually worked on the Humphrey Bear show, putting Humphrey Bear together at Channel 9 for a little while. I've been a VFF District Council Chairman. VFF is our Victorian version of your Federated Farmers. I've been a VFF Grains Council Delegate, President and Conference Organiser for a group called WICFA, Wimmera Conservation Farmers Association, which is a group basically dedicated to looking after our soils with our cropping farming systems. I'm a foundation member of a local grain marketing group, which is designed basically to try and protect local farmers from the vagaries of the international grains industry. I'm a Rotarian. I sometimes claim to be a musician, playing saxophone and trombone. And I also used to be a seed grower, which meant I got parent seed, planted it and grew crops to produce certified canola seed for a company that Monsanto now owns. I farm about 800 hectares of dryland, broadacre cropping land where I grow wheat, barley, canola, field peas, chickpeas, faba beans, oats, and I also run a fair few fine wool merino sheep. We have 16 inches of rain a year and no irrigation. And that's where I live, or where we live. There's my wife Robin sitting up there smiling. Dutch and Bagarra's near Horsham. Horsham is one of the hotbeds of GM research in Victoria. This is our house. It's underground. Built that way in 1988. Now, when the Black Saturday fires were on and we lost 172 Victorians, in those fires it was 46 degrees outside, it was 28 inside there with no cooling. And that's a view inside the house, just to show that they're not horrible, dank and dark. That particular room is 28 foot square. The ceiling is curved. In the middle it's a 14-foot ceiling height. It's quite a comfortable way to live. Here's a couple of our local residents. That's Eddie and Ethel. They're eastern brown snakes. They're each about 6 foot long. Now, whether they're fighting or mating, I'm not 100% sure. But I drove right beside them, stuck the camera out the window and took that photograph, and they didn't even know I was there. So I assume mating. They're amongst the most venomous snakes in the world, those two. And this little fella, he's a swamp wallaby in very poor condition. We had 14 years of drought. There was very little feed about, and this poor bloke had finally found something a little bit green on what remained of our front lawn. So I let him have a feed. This is an Australian shearer. We have quite a few Kiwis over there using wide combs shearing our fine wool merinos, but we do actually still have the occasional Aussie. Now on the 17th of January 2011, sorry, not the 17th, the 11th of January 2011, my neighbour's GE canola was cut and drying, or dried in his paddock, ready for harvest. On the 12th, we had 100 millimetres of rain, about 4 inches. That's a quarter of our annual rainfall, and we got it overnight. The next day, we had another 37.5 millimetres. That's one of my wheat crops. Not long afterwards, as you can see, it's just a touch damp, and by the colour of the wheat, you can see it's well on the way to being ripe. This is windrowed or swathed canola. Now, we cut it like that because canola ripens very unevenly. By the time you harvest by the time the last of it's ripe, ready to harvest, the first of it has had pod shatter and is lying on the ground and you can't get it. So we cut it to make it ripen evenly, to make harvest far more efficient. So after the 100 millimetres of rain... Oilseed rape, is that right? Yes, it is, yeah. Yes, oilseed rape. After the 100 millimetres of rain, this is my neighbour's GE canola crop washed up against his front fence. You can see it's up to the level of the second to top wire of a sheep fence, so it's waist high and it stretches about 25 feet back into the paddock. That is an enormous amount of canola material. It washed clean across the road as well. Some got hung up on the fence there and the rest continued on its way further south into a swamp. This is where it actually pushed the fence over between his place and mine. The fence did run just on that side of that tree, and you can see it's been pushed clean out of the road. This is more GE canola material tangled up in the wire. And this is a close-up shot of those piles of GE canola material, and you can see intact pods full of GE seed. Now, I spent nearly 10 years in marketing before I returned to the farm, and one of the first things you learn in marketing is that a business that doesn't listen to its customers doesn't deserve to survive. And our customers, when this GE issue first came up, said, we do not wish to eat GE. So I'd made a very, very simple decision to not grow it, to only grow conventionally bred grains. So now I had this appearing on my farm. There's GE canola at cotyledon stage. Cotyledons are the first leaves that come out of the seed when it germinates. There's some more cotyledons of canola coming up amongst the stubble. Part of the farming system we use is we don't burn our stubbles, we retain them. They're a source of nutrients. They protect the soil from the wind and they protect the soil from rain impact. This reduces erosion. Yeah.
Magic wand.
Just a little bit of history of canola. Canola was originally rapeseed. It produced an industrial oil of no real human consumption value. It's purely industrial. The Canadians did a fair bit of research to change the profile of the oil in the seed. And the result, they did this by conventional breeding systems, and they called the result canola, Canadian oil. It's been a very, very good crop for them and also for us in Australia, where it provides a very, very useful disease break between cereal crops. Because if we continue to grow cereal on cereal, we tend to get disease build up in the soil and in the trash. By growing canola, it actually has an allelopathic effect on some of those diseases. And following canola with a wheat or a barley crop, you tend to grow a lot better wheat or barley than you would if you followed wheat with wheat. So this was a big enough story for the ABC to come to fly a crew 320. Am I wandering too much? Oh, right. So this was a big enough story for the ABC to fly a crew up 320 odd kilometres from Melbourne. The story went national. This didn't please Monsanto much at all, and they wanted a meeting. So we met in the paddock, and I met a young lady called Mackley and a couple of other Monsanto people. 3-1, I thought wasn't too bad. I reckon I could handle those odds. And I explained to Monsanto that I had a number of concerns. Number one, I had chosen to be non-GE for marketing reasons, among other things. Now, because of this contamination, I had to change my crop rotations because now I had a GE-resistant canola seed on my place. So I had to change my rotation so I could control it in crop. As a result of this, I had to change my herbicide regime and add chemicals to make certain that I knocked this stuff out. I also had to change my marketing. I could no longer claim to be GE free because I was a long, long way from it. And the final point is that this company has a well-deserved reputation in the States for persecuting and prosecuting farmers who haven't complied with their patent rights, to the extent that they spend about $10 million a year on Pinkerton's detective agency, chasing down farmers who might be growing canola out of contract. Now, Pinkerton's detective agency are probably just slightly meaner than the Hells Angels. They're a fairly tough sort of operation. So I got this letter in reply from Mackley, and we've highlighted the effective paragraph, which we'll have a look at in just a small amount of detail. As requested, I confirm my response to you at the time that has never been, nor will it be, Monsanto's policy to exercise its patent rights. Their product was trespassing on my land uninvited. In fact, they were specifically not invited. In circumstances such as this where trace, we'll come back to trace, that's almost a joke, that word there, amounts of our patented seed. Now, my neighbour Lyle, he'd obviously paid for his seed, but it was still theirs. Or traits. And I find it significant that they've included traits in that sentence, because you can have traits transfer from paddock to paddock by pollen. It doesn't have to be seed. Are present in a farmer's fields merely as a result of inadvertent means. Now, this word trace, I sow canola at a seeding rate of 2 to 3 kilograms per hectare. That's 10,000 square metres. Gets 2 to 3 kilograms of seed. You saw it had pushed the fence over coming into my place. Now, if I had only 1 tonne, by the way, that 2 to 3 kilos can produce up to 2.5 tonnes per hectare. Now, if I only had 1 tonne come onto my 40 hectare paddock, I had enough seed to sow 300 plus hectares. And they're telling me I needn't bother because I'd be below trace, which I asked them what trace was. They said 0.9%. There's Julie's figure again. There's not a snowflake's chance in hell that I could be under 0.9% with that volume of seed unless I acted very, very aggressively and very, very quickly to keep it under control. This is an ongoing process. It'll probably take me another 3 or 4 years to be confident I've got it. There is still canola seed germinating that I have found that can only be that GE. These 2 sentences, I think, point out the argument very, very nicely. The only thing that counts is that the gene was found in the field. Whatever the reason, the owner of the field is held liable. There's no excuses. It's like being caught speeding. You should have known. We own you. We own anybody that buys our Roundup Ready products. Now, I've got a few copies of the Monsanto contract if you want to sign them. What's the likelihood of there being contamination even without major rain events or wind events in the case of Julie's friend in Western Australia? That plant there is a canola plant growing, flowering and setting pods in a field. Nothing unusual about that. It happens all the time. We get what we call volunteer canola coming up. Now, when there's no GE around, it's not really an issue. When there's no patented rights around, it's not a major issue. It's something we just deal with. Now there are patented rights, and that plant there is growing on the Horsham Research Farm run by scientists, presumably by best practice. So what's the odds of the entire industry of farmers, some of whom are very good, some of whom are not, some of whom are very busy, some of whom are very lazy, controlling this sort of growth where you can get seed and or pollen flow? This was taken about 2 weeks ago. That's a paddock of faba beans. They're, I don't know, about 3 or 4 inches high in this stage. That yellow patch is canola flowering. The paddock is a known GM grower and advocate. Now, there's no real easy way to control canola in faba beans by herbicides. This canola will go to seed, and when this gentleman harvests his faba beans, there will be canola seed in amongst his faba beans. You can't set your header up to make sure it's totally excluded. We're dealing with 600 and 700 bags, which in faba beans is 50 tonnes an hour going through this harvesting machinery. So, can he sell his faba beans as non-GE if he's got GE canola mixed in with them? Can Australia claim to be still producing non-GE faba beans for the Middle Eastern market? There's a similar case, canola, that's wheat. If that canola is GE and is mixed in with the wheat, can you sell the wheat as non-GE? So it's not just canola on canola, it's also canola on faba beans, canola on wheat, ryegrass on carrots. Two weeks ago, very big, fat, healthy canola plant, putting out flowers, pollen, growing pods, and that's where it is. That's the railway line and the highway between Melbourne and Adelaide. Just over the railway line is a major grain receival centre, and just over the hill in front of us is the Horsham GE Research Farm. So what chance coexistence of having non-GE existing beside GE. When this sort of stuff this is normal. This has been happening for donkeys. So coexistence is a complete fallacy. This cartoon sums up the GE industry beautifully for me, sorry. We're wearing out the pan bearings on the camera. I'll give you a moment to read it. If you can't read it, just put your hand up and I'll read it for you.
It's always better when you read it anyway.
You reckon?
Yeah. You could read it.
All right, I'll read it. Quite suddenly all the good ideas had been used up. Well, actually, not so much used up as misused and abused, in fact, to the point where they didn't work. The good ideas had become dysfunctional, they'd broken down. So the world turned to bad ideas, of which there was a cheap and plentiful supply. It was soon realised that bad ideas cannot be ruined or abused because they're awful to begin with. So the world set to work putting them into practice. Sustainability had come to earth at last. Sums up the GE industry so beautifully, because we've now been chemical farming, what I call chemical farming, where we're using herbicides to control weeds, insecticides to control insects, fungicides to control fungi, most of which are good guys, and high analysis fertilisers to provide nutrients for about 40 years. We're now at the point where all the easy to kill weeds have become hard to kill, and the hard to kill weeds are becoming dominant. So in a lot of respects, the introduction of GE into our cropping systems is simply a last attempt to keep a broken system alive. We're probably at the point now in our dryland cropping world where we need to seriously consider our farming systems. There are a bunch of groups with an interest in GE, how it's adopted and if it's adapted. We've got the seed companies, the research organisations, and I should include the Australian Grains Research Development Council, which is the body that distributes our research levies that we pay. The farmers, and that's a friend of mine, Lester Webb, windrowing canola. The farmer organisations, this is your federated farmers. The regulator and government, and the end user, mum innocent and all the little innocents. Now, these are the ones that actually played a part in how the decisions were made in our part of the world. Now, we've got here the seed companies, the Monsantans of the world. Now, you can't really go crook at them because they're just doing what businesses do. Admittedly, I don't like them, but a business is there to make money by the simplest way they possibly can, and that's what they're trying to do. These guys, the government and regulator, the government research organisations, and the farmers' representative bodies, in my view, failed utterly in Australia. They've left a population exposed to whatever product these guys want to produce because there's no defences. And they've left farmers not only totally exposed to whatever these guys want to produce, but liable for any errors. These blokes will take all the money, but none of the responsibility. They're also having trouble selling the product. Now, the price differential between GE and non-GE canola is about $50 a tonne. So as a desperate attempt to try and hold the market up, they've said, okay, we've done a deal where Cargill, which is one of their partners, will accept the canola and pay us only $10 a tonne less, but I've got to take it to Newcastle. Now, Newcastle is a bit like me getting in a truck and driving my crop from Dunedin to here. At my cost. Further?
Twice that.
Twice that? Yeah. Okay, Dunedin to here and back. At my cost, so that I can receive only $10 less a tonne for my canola than if I'd grown non-GE canola and delivered it to my local silo just down the road. Have I got a deal for you guys? The American Academy of Environmental Medicine brings in a phrase that is the basis of the regulation and labelling of GE in the US, in Europe to the extent that they do it, South America, Australia, and it'll be what they'll be pushing here. That term is substantial equivalence. If a new food is found to be substantially equivalent in composition and nutritional characteristics to an existing food, it can be regarded as safe as a conventional food. Now with stock feed we can swell livers by 17% in a few weeks using GE. We haven't done human trials. This is from Michael Hansen, Consumers Union expert in the States. The principle of substantial equivalence, basis of our regulation and labelling, is an alibi with no scientific basis. We're looking after our population, aren't we? Created out of thin air to prevent GMOs being considered at least as food additives, which is a part of the American Food and Drug Administration Act. And this enables biotech companies to avoid the toxicological test provided for in the Food, Drug and Cosmetic Act and to avoid labelling their products. Now, people with a choice don't buy GE food. To have a choice, you have to have the knowledge. To have the knowledge, we need the labelling. So it has no scientific basis, provides a powerful bureaucratic mechanism, but it's a double standard. Their stuff is similar enough to enter the food supply without testing and labelling according to substantial equivalence. But according to law, it's different enough to require stringent conditions including a technology use contract, severe penalties for non-compliance, and you're not allowed to keep seed for resowing. You've got to sell a lot and buy new seed next year. So is it so close that we don't need to do anything, or is it so far apart it almost needs a new set of laws just to keep it under their control? Labelling. That's the sort of stuff we need so that people can have a choice. There's an interesting chart. It fell off the back of a black truck on a dark night. Names of people, position in the US federal government organisations, Monsanto position over a number of years. 5 down, Michael A. Friedman, Senior Vice President for Clinical Affairs at GD Searle and Company, which merged with Monsanto, Acting Commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration, Mr. Substantial Equivalence. Donald Rumsfeld, and we could put Hillary Clinton in there as Miss October on the Monsanto calendar. Another thing that's happened in Australia is we don't trust our scientists anymore. Because the government have withdrawn from scientific research, now what happens is we get our levies are combined with corporate funds. A good scientist in Australia is now one who can get funding. We need to fix that, because our levies used to combine with public money to produce a product that was owned by us. Now our levies combine with corporate money to produce a product that's owned by the corporates for which they charge. They charge us a levy to produce it, to research it. They charge us for the seed when we buy it, and then quite often they also charge us an endpoint royalty when we grow it and deliver it into the system. They get 3 bites at the cherry. Great little money spinner. So now when we get scientific data presented to us, we always ask, who owns this scientist? It's such a problem now that even science in Australia has started to think they might have a problem. Bit of light relief, that's a couple of kangaroos on the floodplain of the Wimmera River, just next to our house. So we've got back here the red gums growing along the watercourse. These are black box trees on the floodplain. Further up behind us on the lighter hills we've got yellow gum. And there's a couple of eastern grey kangaroos. And this fellow is a tawny frogmouth. He's not an owl, even though he looks like one. He's a night raptor and he's sitting on our solar-powered clothes dryer. So We spend an enormous amount on ag research in Australia, and about 80% of the grain stuff goes into GE. This could be a better way to spend our money. Now, the chart doesn't matter that much. It's just basically a chart showing soil biota, the little bugs that live in their dirt. This is a photograph of this fellow here's block. His name is Bob Baird. This is a 10 metre square isolation area where he's sown native Australian grasses. Some are active, and let them run up and go to seed, and that produces a nursery that provides seed for the area around it. This area here, we've got kangaroo grass, we've got red grass back here, we've got Queensland bluegrass, we've got microlina growing there. That's outside the exclusion zone. He's just had 1,200 sheep on that for a few weeks. The sheep went off fat and he's still got 100% ground cover. That's not bad in an area that gets less than 20 inches of rain a year. Very little fertiliser, very few herbicides. It was bare ground and Patterson's curse 3 years ago. And Patterson's curse is a horrid weed that kills horses. Another shot of his place. This is a couple of mushrooms. That's my boot. There you go for comparison. The biggest creature on this planet is in the Shenandoah Valley, USA. It's 40 kilometres across. It's a fungi. It's a part of the plant system that grows the food that the creatures of this world live on. These fellas are just the fruiting bodies of fungi. How much official research from an agricultural perspective do we do on this? Very, very little. Azotobacter. Farmers in New Zealand are pouring nitrogen onto their pastures in order to get it to grow, to keep the cows productive and all those sorts of things, which is creating emissions issues. It's creating issues in your streams and in your lakes. In Australia, it's creating atmospheric pollution, which makes the globe hot, greenhouse gas issues worse. This bloke, this bloke is free living, doesn't need clover or alfalfa or peas or lupins to live with. He's a free living nitrogen fixer, and he's got a lot of mates who do the same thing. Amount of research we're doing on him? Nothing, officially. There's a few private people looking at them. Mycorrhizal fungi. Every crop I grow, with the exception of canola, grows in conjunction with mycorrhizal fungi in a symbiotic relationship. These brown bits are root tips. They're tiny. This is a very, very big magnification. The white filaments are mycorrhizal fungi. So the plant produces sugars, gives it to the fungi, and the fungi says, thank you, what would you like? And the plant says, oh, a bit of phosphorus, a bit of calcium, a bit of magnesium, love some boron, like spices. So the mycorrhizal fungi goes and finds that and has mechanisms for crowbarring it out of compounds to give to the plant. The plant says, that was nice, have some more sugar. This is so weird that they've sprayed radioactive traced phosphorus onto a plant, and 2 days later that phosphorus has turned up in another plant nearby. So this mycorrhizal fungi says to one plant, your mate over there needs some phosphorus, you've got a bit of extra, can I have some? Yeah, okay. The amount of research we do on this and how this can help our cropping systems? None. We kill this stuff with cultivation and herbicides. This bloke. The green stuff are C4 summer active grasses. They grow in the warm months of the year. The brown stuff is ripe oats, winter grasses. They grow in the cool months of the year. So whilst the winter's on, his C4s are hibernating, not active. His crop's growing. He harvests his crop, the months are warm, his C4s are growing. In a country where rainfall limits our ag system so much, this bloke has a system going where every drop of rain that falls on his farm, regardless of when, produces something. And this bloke's a bit of a pariah amongst the classical researchers, because he's not doing the GE thing. He's a genius. So here are the headlines. GE will contaminate. There is no coexistence. If you think there is, I've got this really big bridge in Sydney that I'll sell you cheap. So it will contaminate GE and organic farms and crops. That is not negotiable. The non-GE growers will carry the cost of trying to remain non-GE. They'll have to prove that they are not. They'll have to have the segregations and the testing. People who have a choice don't buy GE food. My market doesn't want GE food, so I don't want to grow it. GE crops will divide your community. I still talk to Lyle, my neighbour, very politely, and we don't talk about anything serious anymore. Now, country communities are under enough pressure without that sort of rot. Research is controlled by GE companies. If you go to Monsanto and say, I want to do a trial on GE canola, can I have some seed, please? Because you'd want good seed, you'd want it to be of known quality, because that's the way you do a better trial. They'll say no. They'll do the trial, they'll collect the data, they'll do the analysis, and they'll produce the data. Or they'll stop the trial, as they seem to do if the trial isn't going their way, and swelling livers by 17%. Growers carry the risks of production, whether your crop grows or fails. They carry the risk of marketing, whether someone will buy their crop and how much they'll pay. And they also carry the legal risk of whether their neighbour will sue them if they cause contamination, because the seed company won't accept responsibility. We were told we need GE to feed a hungry world. The world is hungry because of politics and economics. We waste 30% of what we grow. Complete furphy. Sorry, Australian slang. It's not true. Yeah, it's a porky, okay. So if people in New Zealand don't act now, the to be GE or not to be GE decision will be made for you, not by you. So you need to protect the source of your food. You need to protect your integrity as researchers and your integrity as farmers, and be able to stand up proudly at any time in the future and say, I live in clean, green, GE-free New Zealand, and I'm damn proud of it. Thank you very much for your time.
Okay, so GE in New Zealand, where are we at now? No commercial crops, certainly no legal ones. We haven't had a contamination event for a few years. I feel quite nervous. I don't know that there's been testing, and if there has, we haven't heard the results. It'd be good if we did. After the previous stuff around Corngate and some other events, there has been some improvement in terms of biosecurity in theory and the testing processes. So we can probably cross our fingers, but we should be testing, and if we find anything, we should be cleaning it up very, very quickly to preserve New Zealand's status. So we'll take it that there isn't any, but there are GE field trials. And I have to press my own button. Yeah, okay. 13 outdoor experiments approved 99 through to 2011. Ruakura out at down at Hamilton there. Rotorua with the trees. Lincoln with crop and food research, now plant and food research. Whakamaru further out in the Waikato, that's no longer existent. 2 withdrawn, 2 with serious breaches, 6 closed down and with no viable outcomes. So it's just 2 current. It's the GE animals, the sheep, not the sheep, they're not using them yet, but the goats and the cattle at Ruakura there, and the Scion one, which is a refresh of an earlier trees application that they've been granted, and it's potentially around about 4,000 trees over a period of up to 20 years. Each batch of trees can go for 8 years, but there's so many different options they can do in their 4-hectare site. That's what's intended. There's none there at the moment. They keep getting chopped down. That's near the Redwoods, and if you want to know where it is anytime, just get in touch. Arborgen is who their partner is. They're doing stuff in containment at Te Teko near Whakatane. They exported 260,000 GE eucalypt plantlets to the US for their field trials, although from Claire's good work for GE Free New Zealand, it appears some of them got exported back in. they're not allowed out in the environment here, so we assume they're tucked away inside somewhere. We still anticipate, no matter what they're saying about 10-year run-ons and all that, a GE ryegrass application sometime. And if they don't, it's because of our good work, I think. Okay, international partners, just like Monsanto over there, Scion with Arborgen, Rubicon was Fletcher Forest that we all knew, was a Kiwi company and the likes. It's actually 80% US owned, and the other, it's a third of Arborgen. It's lost itself into Arborgen effectively. There's two other parts to Arborgen, two major US timber and paper and pulp companies. Plant and Food, they're with Seminis, which is now owned by Monsanto, over some of their stuff. They'll have other partners for some of it too. PGG Wrightson, we've got sort of tucked there, but they will be doing some stuff with a range of people. 51% owned by Agria, the Chinese company that's recently bought them. A bit of Naitahu money. Again, like Rubicon, a little bit of mum and dad investor, but predominantly it's going into overseas ownership. They want to be, as Arborgen, want to be the Monsanto of the GE tree world. Our Wrightsons, we'd say ours, it wants to be the Monsanto of the pasture, GE pasture world, and tends to start in Brazil if our regulatory stuff still puts up resistance, because there's less regulatory pressure and there's a big market there. They own several South African seed companies already, pasture seed companies. Ag Research, Farming NV, and Genzyme, which is the GTC, a big US, it's now owned by the French, I think it's moving around a bit, but it's a major pharmaceutical company. Whakamaru is PPL, that was doing sort of Dolly's sheep type stuff, a lot of poor animal health stuff, failed experiments effectively. PPL went down, 3,000 sheep had to be killed and disposed of there. That's the trees, a few pictures of different things around Scion and the trees. I'll just move on to a better shot. That's the little, the ones before last that got cut down just after they've been planted. They were going to be grown for different reproductive and vegetative tests that they were doing. They weren't Roundup ready like some, so those funny little things there. They ended up, and these ones would have looked like that once. They turn out to be a bit more of an ordinary tree later on. These ones there are meant to be pruned at about 2 metres, round about here. That's 4.5 metres they've been topped at. One of their critical, most important consent conditions was that they were pruned at 2 metres. They were allowed to have a central leader, which is a bit unusual in a pine tree. But the point of that was so that they could check out, see if there were any pollen cones or reproductive structures easily. I mean, if you get up on a ladder to sort of look, it's not quite the same as doing it at ground level, and that was one of the important things. When I found that they weren't pruning it properly, they said, well, later on when they did the investigation after we busted them for their non-compliance, MAF Biosecurity New Zealand, who's the legal auditor and inspector of every field trial in New Zealand, hadn't been doing their job properly, but they said, oh, well, we let them do it because the trees were a bit straggly earlier. And you can see how they might have been, but they've totally filled, not all of them, but they're pretty well filled out, certainly out the 2 metre thing. But they hadn't told Irma. Irma was the decision maker. So I'm zipping along the road at 120 k's, as I really have to struggle not to sometimes. And a policeman stops me. He says, it's okay, Steffan. He might be a range of reasons. He might say, it's okay, Steffan, you can do that. But he forgot to tell Parliament that to change the law or something. Those guys have a statutory job to follow those conditions. And even if they changed the conditions, it was the submitters that said, hey, this is a real risk. And so they would have even had an opportunity to appeal because of they would have known about the change. It was outrageous. They also said when there we go, this is in the investigation, I said, hey, you've got animals going in and out under your fence. MAF, Biosecurity New Zealand, now part of Ministry of Primary Industries, was meant to inspect that on a monthly basis. There was no way in hang they were doing that. And that was one of the holes. I couldn't get my arm down there. They said, this is them trying to turn it around and put the spin on me. MAF is still investigating the cause of these holes and has not ruled out the possibility these were man-made for publicity purposes. Yeah, we're into publicity, all right, because we're really into exposing these blighters. There's some of the rabbits in there, and there's, you know, if they were coming in and out, there's a cat in there one time. I got a bit of a fuzzy photo of it, but there's rabbits showing up in all of their annual reports, and they would poison them or shoot them, and they say there was no more of a problem. And I said, well, just how come these rabbits were getting in? We didn't even notice it for a while, but ultimately some people did, and they followed the rabbits down under the holes and cut some trees down. And they did it again this year. Horizontal gene transfer, HGT, that is one of the risks out of GE as to what is happening, and we saw what's around the mycorrhiza, what might happen through antibiotic marker resist, goods that are in there, the bacteria and stuff that's been mucked around with, the new different cell stuff. Is there a chance it will go over into the soil microbes? There is a reasonable chance, and that is, you know, what do we know about that? They're not even doing that properly. They say they have, couldn't find any, and hey, it's all good and clean and tidy style after a very short trial. What if they cover these hills like in my area in Marlborough, where there's such land disturbance and slippage and movement, if there is a problem? That was an onion trial. That's long gone, but he managed to spill seed outside his trial area as well. And I'm just actually painting a dirty wee picture of New Zealand's scientists involved in GE and how their lack of responsibility, in my view, integrity is. This is the GE brassica field trial. That's at the end of season from one of their photos we got after we busted them for non-compliance. And this is one of the conditions from the URMA decision, Environmental Risk Management Authority. End of the trial season, all material not needed for research purposes needs to be removed from the site. Not only that, it was meant to be autoclaved and all sorts of things. A couple of things that are in the documents as well. All plants on initiating reproductive development to be removed to a glasshouse site or killed. So as soon as they look like there'd be effectively a commercial type head on a broccoli or a cauliflower, was another one of the things, or a cabbage, or the forage kale, gone. It's meant to be gone. That one there, that's their own photos, just starting to burst into flower. And they also disagreed with us. In fact, it was Dr. Elvira Domisay, a previous fellow co-chair of Soil and Health Association, excuse me, but also a previous crop and food GE onion scientist in a previous life, who's definitely opposed to GE in this day and age as well, who pointed out that these things happen. They said, oh, very unlikely. Well, these things are meant to be removed when they got to head. The 7th of the 3rd, the 7th of March in 08, there they go, the same row a month later, more than a month later, totally bolted. Cauliflowers, you know what happens if you leave a cauliflower bolted and going through to flower. They were meant to be gone. That was some of the stuff there, had some rogue rots and things. They never identified what they were. We've got to see all their notes. One of the things that MAF Biosecurity said after, when I was concerned because of GE plants flowering, was that there was no actual flowers around or anything. It was very unlikely that there was sort of insects, enough insects around to move pollen around. Yeah, right. This is what the site looked like when I went back to see what the summer 2008 crop was like. Well, they hadn't planted one, but they had, everything had been, you know, the forage colour that you saw lying there, other ones have been chopped off at about that height. And you know what it is, if you do a cabbage or something, they sprout and go for it again and come away like that, or that. All those other arrows are pointing to a range, and there was tons of them. In amongst the grasses, and by the way, no flowers. These are some of the buffer crop. They had to do a different type of brassica. There's brassica napa, oleracea and rapa, and they had to do a different one as part of their buffer to theoretically reduce the chance of leakage. Well, they've got flowers, they've got seed pods, all of them around the edge. Had they pollinated this one, the GE one that I took a photograph of, it's got a flower, but a bit like the canola on the side of the roads in Australia, and also are on the sides of the roads in New Zealand, but we hope they're not GE. That was pollinated by something.
that is the prize sort of photo in a way, because that was our first inkling that they were being irresponsible there and letting stuff go through the flower. The most important consent condition for that one, and by the way, the person that was chairing that IRMA panel that granted that and helped set the conditions, he actually had SMOCO, effectively in the same SMOCO room as the person applying for it. He was with Hort Research at those times, she was with Crop and Food. But all the CRIs, they come to those hearings and they support each other in those hearings. So they did listen to us, we made a lot of noise about pollination, and they said that they had to come off. So when we found that, that was actually quite critical to us. Because of what they said about the rabbit holes and doing other stuff around the scion thing, I made sure I got a Christchurch Press reporter to come with me out there when I climbed over the fence again to take some more for photos. Not allowed to climb fences anymore. But that was very important because they went to lie, they went to cheat and be duplicitous again, and we told them about it, they went there and they looked and everything. He went back to them and said about the flowering plant, no flowering plant. Well, he was able to flick them through that photo. Half an hour later, their official policy changed. Oh yes, well actually there was one. This is between 8:30 and 9 of an evening. These guys would lie, would do anything. That's their photos. They had those, and they were saying there was nothing flowering. There was no seed stuff, and then they played it down. That's another one of their slippages where they leaked the Arabidopsis, a little wee plant that they do a lot of tests on. It leaked, there was an investigation into that, and that's been closed down, that one. That's the old Whakamaru site. That's a major sump in the ground where the waste from the enclosed animal places, where they had those 3,000 sheep and the likes, all the drainage would come down into this sump area off these concrete floors, and then we assume the ashes from the burnt sheep, 3,000 sheep went there as well. At Ruakura we've got the cows and the goats, and that's current at the moment. I was able to show our visitors that the other day, and we even managed to meet the manager by chance as he came to see what the hang we were up to. But a bundle of different human proteins and others, drug. They do have a cow there now. This was 2010. Claire and I got a tour there a while ago, and they've got a little animal cow called Irby, how they call them. That's a drug that can be produced on a lab shelf. They are trying to do this, so they've got animal factories pumping in New Zealand. Heaps of deformities, low fecundity, less than 4% live birth for the embryo transfers. Just really ugly, ugly things. The animals look okay, the ones that survive eventually, most of them. So, although one of them, one batch died, their ovaries were growing so big that the arteries around them ruptured and they had to put the others down. Now, they're not allowed to send anything out from there. All animals, all fetuses, all guts material, blood and gore has to go down. Dead animals have to go down in these pits. 7 metres deep, offal pits, yay round. They're sleeves around the top while they're using them so that they don't fall in on themselves. And there's been quite a number of holes dug over the last 10 years. Horizontal gene transfer is the ugly one there. What thing might come out of a mammal that's fiddled around with all number of different proteins from a range of different animals? The pits are up on the hill. They put milk waste out as well because they're not meant to be carting that away. And there's excrement and all the goo, and there's lots of water, and there's a real lakes and everything. It flows in and out from the contained areas into other animal areas that aren't GE, and ultimately goes down into the drains underneath Hamilton City and into the Waikato River. So, what did IRMA say for them? IRMA said, because of that risk, and in the decision, they really emphasised that level of risk, because if something could go wrong, it could be seriously wrong. We could have some new thing that would be very bad for humanity and or the environment. They're my words, those last ones. But that's essentially what it is. So there's your 7 metre deep hole. They can fill it up to 5 metres. They have to not allowed to fill it for that last 2 metres. And then they backfill it with soil, clean soil from away, and then it decomposes. They keep topping it up because it slumps. And we've had a look at that. This is, then they have to try and find horizontal gene transfer because that is the big risk. But it's a bit like Monsanto testing its food. They have to test it, and if they find it, they have to stop the experiment and mitigate. I don't know how the hell you mitigate. You've got some wild new bacterial thing or whatever in the soil. They don't want to find it either. In the first year, they did find a little bit of stuff, but it wasn't significant apparently. So the next year, that's where they tested. And the next year, that's where they tested. And the next year, that's where they tested. The next year, they even went higher, 300 mils. As Professor Jack Heinemann from Canterbury University, who went through and did an analysis, a proper academic analysis of their annual reports, thanks to Claire from GE Free New Zealand, who organised that to happen. And he did a peer-reviewed report on it. He said that's the equivalent of us doing something 1,000,000 miles away and expecting to get the results. Those guys, I believe, were cheating all of us as taxpayers, were cheating the globe potentially, and they were certainly cheating IRMA. In a subsequent application that IRMA was pretty freely granting to them back then, and very broad applications, they said, well, that's not an issue because you're not finding anything. They're not even looking at the applications properly. That's now Environmental Protection Authority. Anyway, we're going to have some questions. So, will you be affected if GE trials are approved in an area near you, a field near you? Has this region got GE free or GE liability and coexistence and segregation rules? The government's not doing it properly. If not, and IRMA, now the EPA approves some national sort of GE trials, something that would go nationally, because remember, Ag Research wanted to do farms all over the country at one stage. You can effectively do nothing. So for how long will we be able to ensure our plants, animals and environment are GE free? We've got to really maintain that fantastic position we have and actually get these field trials closed down. What we can do, well, you know, I've got a small bias here, join the Green Party. We've got 14 MPs now, and I'm really rapt that we've got somebody in every select committee now. I sort of waited 10 years to get on that on the select committee to do with primary production, which does the bulk of the environmental effects in this country would be through agriculture, forestry and fisheries, and I really feel privileged to get there, so thanks for those that helped. GE Free New Zealand, Claire there's probably got some joining forms there. Do fantastic work with a handful of dedicated people, even put a house on the line for one of the court cases to the High Court. And have won some, lost some, but really kept the pressure on. Very good. Soil and Health Association, do the Organic NZ magazine. I was their spokesperson from 2003 through till the election. Yep, I did climb that fence. They didn't charge me, they talked about it. I have no problem that you know, they might have done that because I think I did a very good thing. It stopped that Brassica trial. Claire helped me find it and work it out. We stopped that, and not only that, Plant and Food had a application granted already to do 11 different of the allium family, garlic, onions, and they'd already stuffed up before. So they said, we're not doing it, and those have lapsed now, so we're good. The trees are under a bit of pressure. So grow and buy organic and GE free. The message we've had today is about conventional as well, but if you want to be really sure about what's in the New Zealand food supply, because FSANZ, Food Standards Australia and New Zealand, have granted approval, they've never said no actually, to about 75 odd different GE food lines into Australia and New Zealand consumers. So keep informed, join or form a local GE free group. And something that we can't emphasise enough, write to the papers, write to your editor, talkback radio, etc., and be active. And you have been active. You've come here tonight to hear this message, and it's one you would have got probably anywhere else. Tell your friends about it. We'll get stuff up on web links, such as GE Free New Zealand, Soil and Health's, the Green Parties. Please follow it. Please disperse it.